Welcome back to the LS Community Church podcast. We are here in Lee Summit, Missouri, and Lee Summit Community Church is all about making disciple makers who share the gospel, who saturate Lee Summit with the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And I'm Kevin Hartman. I'm here with Corbett Cutts and Stan Rodda. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, here we are. Hey, it's a new year. It's a new year. Here we are.
We're
2025.
We're into 25. This is ridiculous.
All right. Who wants to kick us off? Who's New Year's resolution? Are you guys resolution guys or not so much?
Mine last year was to lose 10 pounds. I only got 15 to go.
Hey,
so,
there you go. Good job.
just carry that one forward, I guess.
Yeah, something like that for me too.
I don't really do resolutions as much anymore. I'm going to stick with something that I know is going to be successful, and I'll just say I'll continue being a Chiefs fan. Yeah, just continue with the winning streak.
Mm-hmm. All right.
It's proven successful for the last few years, so I'll just stick with that.
Yeah.
Might as well.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, we are actually here to do a podcast, so why don't we get into that? How about that? We're in the middle of the story. So this is 31 stories rather from Scripture that build this grand narrative of what the Bible is all about. And we kind of find ourselves in this new series right in the middle. We're calling this Act 3, Losing My Religion. So I feel like we need to cue the music,
Cue some REM.
Right? Yeah. Cue a little music.
Don't ask me to sing, but yes.
Yeah, you can pause the podcast, go listen, you find out what we're talking about. I don't know, maybe not. Let's keep rolling here. So we just concluded our second act that we called Game of Thrones that took us from Joshua all the way through to the building and the consecration of the temple. So that's where we're picking up here. And we're going to move all the way through the consecration of the temple, through Kings and much of the story, another 400-year plus period of history in Israel up to Daniel and exile in Babylon. So maybe this is where you should pause the podcast, go pop some popcorn, and then come back, because there is a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of stuff going down with the Jewish people and the nation of Israel in this period of history. So I'm glad, Stan, you're here because you're going to tell us all about
Corbett's here.
Well, just before, I know you set the stage here, but before we even get to kind of Act 3 in this part of the Bible, I just want to say for those that are following along in the story, like if you've made it this far, like pause for a moment and like legitimately congratulate yourself, because so often, I mean, I'll speak from experience. Like I'll just be honest and put it out there, and you can kick me off the couch if you need to. But like, it's hard to get through what we've gone through in the Old Testament for so many Christians, right? To go through, we went through Genesis and into like through the Exodus and the story of the wandering and into the land. I mean, there's a lot there, and a lot of it is foreign. And we're still kind of working our way through the Old Testament. And there's a lot that we're about to now kind of step into in the story of Israel as they try to, really have this monarchy. But, it's not to lose sight of how much ground we've covered and how important that is. And for many people, I suspect it might be the first time in a long time they've gone through that.
I would agree. It's actually funny that you're saying it, because then right before we started the story, for those who are part of our church, they all went through an Ecclesiastes series with us. And I doubt many Christians have taken time to try to unpack that book. And man, we had a lot of fun there too. So yeah, if you've made it this far in the story with us, pat yourself on the back, give yourself a high five, because we've waded through some pretty deep water.
Yeah, that's really good. Just one other thing, if you're listening or watching on a platform where you can give us some feedback, do that. Drop some comments about your experience so far. Yeah. We'd love to hear from you. All right. So Act 3, Losing My Religion. Stan, walk us through the next 5 weeks that we're looking at.
Yeah. So almost all the way up through basically the end of mid to the end of February, this idea, Losing My Religion, we're going to go from right after the time of King Solomon. And so what's about to happen is, it's been interesting because as we've seen the people move from theocracy to monarchy, trying to get established. Basically, what's going to happen is David has just united them, finally brought it all together. Solomon does some good things, but makes some mistakes that basically establish the beginning of the end in many ways for Israel. And just, one king in, and they already divide. Now they're a northern and a southern. We're going to see everything from good kings, really terrible, awful kings. We're going to see prophets in both the north and the south of Israel. So North Israel, South Judah. We're going to see some of those prophets were going to rise up in captivity. Israel's going to fall to the Assyrians. Judah's going to fall to Babylon. It really is this kind of, in many ways, beginning of the end for poor Israel. The reason we're calling it Losing My Religion is because so much of their story up to this point has been trying to establish a brand new God-given identity. And part of that identity was in things like the promised land. I mean, one of the earliest promises is, I'm going to give you a land. And so Israel puts so much into the land. And when the land becomes a question mark, they kind of fall apart. They lose their identity. They lose their religion. It happens with the tabernacle, with the Ark of the Covenant. They lose the Ark of the Covenant. The whole thing falls apart. They lose their identity in who God said they were and what their relationship with him is about. And so this is an interesting period of time between kings in the north and the south, the prophets, the fall to Assyria, the fall to Babylon, and then this really weird book in there called Daniel, where then you start to get these visions and dreams and lions, and it feels like Israel's just lost their identity. It all the wheels just kind of come off the bus, and we're going to spend 5 weeks unpacking what it looks like when you miss the mark on your identity about who God says you are. And it's going to be a little bit of a crazy ride, but there's also some really, really powerful lessons in there for us to pay attention to.
Yeah. So Corbett, you're kicking this series off, correct?
I am. Yep.
So this is chapter 14, which is our first chapter in this particular act, chapter 14 in the storybook, which you can find a link to in our podcast notes if you haven't purchased that yet. Chapter 14, we've titled Shifting Away from Israel's God-Given Identity and how that led to division. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a microcosm of what Stan just kind of gave in the broad summary of the entire act, right? You think about this context of as Israel is crossing the river, quite literally into the land, it begins this shift, right? And we got to step back into like them saying, okay, this is our space. How do we protect it? God's given it to us. He's blessed it to us. Like, this is ours. And so they go through this, okay, we need to protect it, right? And they look around and go, well, we need to look like everybody else around us, right? And so there's the quest for a king. Like they need a ruler. And it seems like God along the way is just like, you have one, it's me, right? You have one, it's me. And finally he's just like, all right, fine. You know what? Here you go. And then about 37 seconds go by and it's like, how's that working for you? Right?
Not working well.
And I think the thing about it is that it's easy. And as I think about this chapter in particular, Kevin, it's easy for us to read back and go, man, they missed it. Right. They just did. They had their king and God. They lost their identity because they were so focused on needing a king or needing a temple or needing something that made them look like everybody else. And it's true. But in the same time, like, I think we do ourselves and Israel a disservice to just kind of paint with such a broad brush, because in the moment, I think that there's some genuine honesty in all this to say, God's given us this land. How else are we supposed to protect it? We have to have some sort of government. We have to have someone who cares for us in the lower story to make sure that the land that is ours is, protected from foreign invaders. And so but when even those good things become like the object of your affection, like it starts to you lose focus and it starts to have a negative impact. So I think that's a big piece that we'll see as we kind of unpack that particular chapter. There's a lot of other interesting things that we'll see in that story, but as I think about that particular moment, like that's an area that I think we'll kind of dig into a little bit in chapter 14.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's so many things for us, to your point, that are good, like God-given things, blessings. And then eventually the challenge for us is the exact same thing, right? You kind of latch onto that blessing. You assume that that's like the thing. And it's like, no, that's a gift. That's nice. That's not the primary thing God's trying to get. And so it's their issue in this period of time is our issue still today in many ways.
Yeah, I see it as a really interesting difference. And we've talked about this before, Stan. It's like the difference between icons and idols, right? I mean, an icon, its intention is to be an object that directs your attention and worship towards the right thing, right? And versus an idol is what the actual object of your worship. And there's an element of that to say there are good things, there's blessings. There's nothing wrong inherently with wanting a king or having a beautiful temple, a place for God to dwell. Like, but those all ought to be like the blessings, the good things, the icons that point back towards the one who gave them to you.
Right.
And it's when those get, confused or seen as synonyms that it becomes problematic.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So 37 seconds and we see things begin to unravel and some serious problems. And these next three chapters, we're looking at 15, 16, and 17, the continuous reminder from God that they were to find their identity in him, followed by how not living God's identity is the beginning of the end for Israel. We see division. We see all kinds of problems within Israel. And then finally, living a false identity leads to complete collapse, which is what we see happen in the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
Those are your weeks, Stan. What stands out?
Yeah. I think what stands out to me, the more I think and kind of wrestle through some of this, is how many strands of the collapse we see throughout their entire history. Like sometimes it's interesting. You open up your Bible and you just start reading in 2 Kings or Chronicles or whatever, and you're like, oh man, they blew it right there. Oh, they really messed that up. And you're like, they did, but it started hundreds of years ago. Like they were making these mistakes all along. So that little bit of like, I don't know if you want to call it like a rebellious DNA almost that exists inside of them. That was rearing its ugly head 3 months out of Egypt. They had barely left Egypt and just barely months into their trip out, they already wanted to go back. And God continues to have to say, this is who I am. This is who you're following. Why would you want to go back to that? Moses gets frustrated with him. God gets frustrated with him. It's a whole thing. And then you go through the period of the judges and their theocracy and then the monarchy and, well, we want a king now and this. And there's these threads all throughout of just like, man, do they get it? Like, do they understand what's happening? And there's a piece in that that's missing that by the time you get to David and some of his mistakes, Solomon makes them even worse. And then just another generation away with his son Rehoboam, I mean, you start to see those cracks really start to show up. And the whole thing then once again collapses. So we're going to talk through that period a lot about like when the kingdom split into two. So you're Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And we're going to talk a little bit about, these kings that rise up. And in an effort, once you're off base with your identity and you're trying to start grasping at straws to like make things work, usually the end result of that is more chaos. Yeah. Is the usual end result of that. Yep. And so then you have these kings who rise up who are grasping at every god they can get their hand on. So then you're back into Asherah worship, Baal worship. You end up at one point, Israel is into child sacrifice. I mean, the whole thing really falls apart. And so we're going to go through that. And then we're going to see Assyria attack. And it's interesting because it's like, well, why do bad things happen? Well, God's also trying to like wake his people up because they're missing the point. And so there's a little bit of judgment in that. And then, a few years later, Babylon's going to come up from the south and they're just going to tear the whole thing apart. You're going to have tribes in the north that just basically go missing to the timeline of history. I mean, the whole thing feels like it just collapses. And it's funny because I think it's Second Chronicles ends with this really interesting thing happening with the king of Babylon and the king of Judah at the time. And they're having this conversation, and the king of Babylon invites the king of Judah to come and sit with him and eat with him. And this whole entire thing from like 1 Samuel through the end of Chronicles just feels like just the slowest fall and collapse ever. It's like you can just see them stumbling down the hill. And then there's this little bit at the very end, like the last page that's like, but then the king of Babylon invites the king of Judah in to eat, and he has a place for him at the table. I think that verse, I'm not a theologian or a scholar, but the last verse of Chronicles, Second Chronicles, the very last verse is a incomplete sentence. It's not even finished in the manuscript. But it's the king of Babylon saying, may God restore you and lift you up. And then the sentence just kind of ends. And so all of this downfall for just generations, just this collapse. And the very last little bit goes, maybe there's just a glimmer of hope that the God's not done with Israel yet. So it's just it's tough to read through some of the history of that, but man, it's really cool at the same time. Like, yeah, God's still pursuing his people through this crazy, messed up history that we're going to explore. So it's going to be a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about this before the taping of this podcast. We have 1st and 2nd Kings.
Yeah.
1st and 2nd Chronicles.
Yeah, the Samuel and Kings kind of go together, and then you've got Chronicles that's it's a separate kind of a thing, but they basically tell the same story.
Why do we have
in many ways
some of the same story repeated? What's going on there?
I want to hear Corbett's answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it presents for some people it's not a problem, right? They're just both there. It depends on I think how you approach scripture, and a starting point from a frame of reference. I think oftentimes people will lean towards is you'll use the synoptic gospels as a frame of reference to say, well, maybe there's some similarities here, and so by that synoptic gospels being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you set John to the side because it's a little cosmic, right? But you look at those and you say, okay, well, those are the three different contextual views of the story of Jesus, like the good news that is Jesus Christ. And they're all written by different people from different perspectives for different purposes and audiences. And you say, well, maybe that's kind of that same view that you could look at Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And I think it's a helpful starting point. But to me, I think the challenge with that is that when you think about the New Testament, you look at the synoptics, scholars will date those manuscripts to have been written within about 20 years of each other. Right, like 20, maybe 30. If you go John, it gives a 40-year range, but they're relatively close, right? And so, I would say that, there's plenty that's happening. Like the church is kind of really building, right? There's a lot going on in that time period, but it's not a lot of time, historically speaking. When you look at the difference between like Kings and Chronicles specifically, Kings itself is written just prior to like pre-exilic time, but just right on kind of in the precipice of that. So we'll put it in like the 580 BCE. Chronicles is a post-exilic period, right? That puts it somewhere, it's a big 400-year range, but we'll say 350 just to make it easy. So that means the time period between those is 250 to 350 years. And so one, that's a big period of history. Yeah. And then secondarily, though, you say, okay, well, what happened right in that time period? And you're like, okay, well, the kingdom fell. Then the temple fell. You were exiled, and then the temple fell. And then you were able to return, and then you rebuilt the temple because the temple gets rebuilt in 516, somewhere thereabouts. So you have all of this that happens. And so what ends up being is, yes, they're written from two different time periods, but really it's as much, I'd say, is a theological, like kind of wrestling match as it is a biblical one. Right. And so they're written for different purposes. On the one hand, I think, Kings, you might say, is perhaps written more with this like view of, kind of the approach of, well, what's the consequences of our disobedience? Right. And this is all like what we've been talking about. You wanted a king. Okay, you got one. How's that working for you? Like, you had expectations, you weren't following them. Like, there are consequences for your actions. Chronicles, on the flip side of that, is now looking back, and there is this, I think, different lens, and not that it's absent of like consequences for one's actions, but it's more of this lens of like this idea of faith and restoration, right? This the return and the rebuilding the temple, and like God's not done with us yet, and this can happen. And so what you get is it's a different telling of very much the same story. And it's not that one is right and the other's wrong, or one's right and one's more right. They're just two different versions with two different lenses. And so it's almost like if you thought about Kings, to me, is written more along the lines of, if you're going to write a historical account of the Civil War, and you just kind of went through every single like event that happened over that period of time. And then Chronicles is more of like, well, what if we were going to write a biopic of Abraham Lincoln? Right? It's that same time period, but you're going to focus on certain things. And if you are not going to be, a historian in a modern sense, maybe you take a bit of like, I'll just call it creative licensing to put Abraham Lincoln in the best light possible because he is the hero of your story.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you get personally between Chronicles and Kings is like, I mean, there's lots of differences, but one of the main ones that people see is that, David in the Chronicles is in a much more positive light. Like the story
leaves out Bathsheba entirely. She's not there. Yeah, leaves it out entirely.
Yeah, it's focused on his leadership and that he's, the importance and the purity of the Davidic lineage. Like that's the underscore. So like you leave out the bad stuff because that undermines the point of trying to portray this, I would say, an idealistic version of the king.
Yeah. It is an interesting question and definitely worth the conversation, right? To kind of wrestle with, you read the Kings, you read Samuel and Kings. And the other fun part about that is just, literally we have a first and second of each of these because they ran out of room on a scroll and had to write the rest of the history on a second scroll. So somehow in our Bibles, it didn't become Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. It became first and second. But that's a funny little tidbit of like, just ran out of room. Okay. Anyway, but you read Samuel and Kings and you've got, this specific lens to your point. There's a lot of the negative stuff in there. Bathsheba's in there, Nathan confronting, and then you've got Chronicles, which is written at a different period of time. A different lens, different perspective, leaves out all the bad. And so you've got this really interesting history about these and you read through them. And if I were to put myself in the shoes of the everyday, average, normal Christian who's not reading, the blogs and isn't, wrestling with the deepest pits of some of these conversations. One of the things I would say to help try to make some of that conversation simpler for them to digest almost is if Samuel and Kings, as you've already said, they're written on the front end of the exiles. So it's almost like that history is being written to remind them why they're about to go through a really bad time. Because you've made this mistake and this one and this one, all the negative stuff's in there. And then you go 350 years later, you have Chronicles on the back end post-exile. And it's like it's written from this light of God is still good. God is still faithful. God is still in pursuit. He's still being faithful to his people. And it's this kind of flip side with this uplifting kind of view. And so as you read through them, it's helpful, for those who are just, the everyday follower of Jesus who's going, what do I do with this? Part of what's helpful to note there is just the difference in those two. And that's oversimplified for sure, but a way to kind of grasp, okay, what is it that I'm actually reading here? What's going on? Why is it the same story, but it's different? Why is something being left out? That kind of thing. So
the other thing I'd add from a modern, like everyday Christian perspective is that I think that one of the things I take away outside of the content itself is that if we think that Israel is trying to wrestle with this idea of like, where is God in this moment, in this time, right? As they're watching the kingdoms collapse, they're like, okay, well, the question is, where's God? Well, now it's obvious that these are consequences for our actions, right? Yeah. He's there in some capacity, maybe not the way you want it to be. In the same way that post the return and the rebuild of the temple, they're asking the same questions, but now they're looking at that moment in history. And I think that, Jesus nearly commands it, like we see it here, but I think it just gives us that confidence to say that that's what we need to do too. Right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with asking the same questions that the disciples were asking or Israel was asking throughout the Bible, but in our own context. Not that it's going to become another book of the Bible because the canon's closed, but that's what makes this kind of the living word, is that we need to ask those same questions in light of who we are and what we're experiencing today. So I think there's some real like sticky, tangible aspect of it today, just, even absent, kind of digging into like, what are these weird stories I'm reading?
Speaking of like asking those same questions in light of today, what if we did that with Daniel? What does Daniel have for me today? So, because you're closing up the series, with Daniel, there's some fun stuff there.
What we just talked about is what makes Daniel the perfect place to close out this series, because there's a collision of so much of what we just talked about in the book of Daniel. So that we've titled this, Israel Begins to Rediscover God's Identity for Them. So for just a second to set this up, I hearken back to my Sunday school days,
Felt board?
Yeah, little felt board, little Betty Lukens felt board action. And I won't name any of my Sunday school teachers, but it went a lot like this. Going through the book of Daniel, a couple really cool stories at the beginning, Yeah. We got the fiery furnace, the lion's den, and then it's like, I don't know, might just stop there for a while and we'll leave the rest to the adult Sunday school classes to talk about. Right. But, when I got to the adult Sunday school classes, I was kind of sad to discover that all this stuff in Daniel had to do with future stuff, like this isn't happening yet. It's maybe some of it has, but most of it's for the distant future. And I think that we've kind of formed a couple of camps that would suggest that the occurrences that we see in Daniel, especially 7 with the 4 beasts and other sections of the book, happened between the time of Daniel and leading up to Jesus and were concluded, or most of it is still yet to happen, which in a way kind of separates us here and now from the story of Daniel. It doesn't really apply to us. So I was a little disappointed in discovering Daniel, really the rest of Daniel. I guess I wasn't missing out anyway, got the good stuff. We'll find out the other stuff later, when in fact there is so much to be applied to us here and now today. And I would suggest that one thing we can all agree on, whether we're in the camp that believes a lot of this is yet to happen versus it already happened, or a conglomeration of the two, or some other idea, is that there is some symbolism that we find in the book of Daniel that pulls to light the realities that Israel was facing in Daniel's day and before Daniel's day, and what we're facing here and now. Some realities that go back to the DNA that you were talking about. So if you go back to the first page in the Bible, we find God creating everything. And when he gets to man, he creates man differently than everything else. He creates man in his image. And from the very first breath of man, he told us that our identity is to reflect his image. And so whatever you believe that means, at its core, what it truly means is that the humankind of creation is the representative of the character and nature of God to the rest of all creation. And if we live any other way, we live this broken, perverted idea of identity. And another point you made was that the more we lean into that, the further we get away from our true image, our true identity, and we experience more brokenness. Just this cycle repeats. It gets worse. It gets more deranged and degraded, and that's what we see in the nation of Israel. So we see early on in Daniel this reality of image or identity, and then we talked about self-control versus consequences. So another aspect of humankind is that God gave us self-control. He gave us a conscience and the ability to choose rather than to act beastly or instinctively. He gave us the ability to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the right thing over the instinctive thing. And when we choose not to do right, we suffer the consequences. So we see this time period in which Daniel is living. We see he and his people suffering the consequences of this cycle of poor choices and living outside of their true identity. So there are two other things that come up in Daniel, and that is justice and consequences. So we see justice and consequence. God is a just God. He's going to judge us, and he will judge us rightly, and there are consequences to our choices. So the poor choices that Israel was making had consequences. Their consequence at the time of this writing is exile in Babylon. So we keep reading through the story, and Daniel prays, and God, I realize through the words of Jeremiah that we're in this 70-year period of exile. Thank you for your mercy. Any way you could cut that a little short, or, can we, maybe lessen the sentence a little bit? And God says, well, here's the deal. It's not going to be 70 years. It's going to be more like 5 centuries of difficulty and hardship. So there's so much imagery in this book that helps us see we were created in the image of God to reflect his character to all creation. When we fail, there are consequences, but there is hope. And so as we read through chapter 7, we see these really weird dreams and visions of 4 beasts and a super beast with 10 horns and a horn that's got eyes and all, just, I don't know what he ate that night, but it must have been pretty powerful.
Gas station sushi.
Gas stations.
He's only a couple horns off from being Bill Belichick, this is all I'm saying about that. It was a few horns off. So the 400 or 500 years you're talking about in Daniel, though, that doesn't have to do with like tribulation or anything for us. Do we want to unpack some John Darby right now?
Let's go for it.
Just unpack some John Darby from 1830 right now?
Right.
No, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. We could have some fun with that.
Yeah. So. Wouldn't everybody like us to answer that question, right? Yeah.
Oh, we're gonna at some point. Yeah. It's coming.
Yeah.
We got time. We're gonna have to answer the rapture question. We get toward the end there of the New Testament.
So where I would land this conversation is Daniel 7 refers to this figure who comes on the scene, who is titled the Son of Man. And what I find very interesting is the linkage between this title and the title that Jesus refers to himself most as. So he accepted this title that people gave him, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, but he more often referred to himself as the Son of Man. And so I think that's just a hearkening back to, this is me personally, but I believe that's a hearkening back to, hey, all you Bible nerds, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Like Daniel 7, like, hello.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Those links are.
And so the reason why I bring that up to conclude this last reality that we see in Daniel is the reality of hope and forgiveness. that ultimately he says, Daniel, there is hope. There is hope. You're in exile and it feels like it's hopeless right now, but know that this rule of beastly kingship, that we see portrayed in this book, it's going to come to an end. The beast will be destroyed. The Son of Man will reign and will usher in his kingdom. And I'd say this too. It's then when I realize this, it's then that I realize Jesus' kingdom has been ushered in. He also said the kingdom is drawn near, referring to himself when he was here, when he had his feet on this earth. And so it's not merely a future thing. Some people refer to it as already, but not yet. So the kingdom has come.
Yeah.
But it's not completely fully realized yet. The work is still going on.
Yeah. Well, that's an Advent thing. It's the already, but not yet. Yeah. That's a great.
So there's lots of crazy. We've all had crazy dreams. I don't know that I could dream something as crazy as I read in some of these chapters. I'd have to eat the gas station sushi.
Don't do it.
Nights.
Don't do it. Not worth it.
I don't want to pay that price.
No.
Well, and just before we go up too far off field, Kevin, I'll say this for those who are listening. We get to Act 5. So, subscribed, get alerts, whatever the kids say to do these days. You're not alone there. Jesus most certainly knows Daniel 7. I mean, he wouldn't call it Daniel 7, but he knows that, and is purposeful in his choosing of the title of Son of Man, and we'll actually dig into that in one of the weeks. So stay tuned.
Yeah, so I love the connection, the connective tissue, if you will, in Daniel that brings us from Genesis 1 all the way through Jesus and the entering of the kingdom, the opportunity to enter his kingdom through the person and work of Jesus.
There are some, there's a longer conversation to be had. I don't know if we have time to encompass all of it in the next few minutes we have together, but it is interesting because when you read the Old Testament, and this is something I hear from people, and it comes up quite often. It's the challenge of reading the Old Testament versus reading the New Testament. Why do you turn the page from the old to the new and all of a sudden God seems different, and there are some very challenging passages in the Old Testament to wrestle with that make you kind of go, how do we handle this? Like, what are we supposed to do with it? And, some of them, even that you're referencing in Daniel, like, these dreams, like, what do you do with this giant statue of 4 different materials and then a rock and, what do you
smashing its
rock
feet,
smashing, what do you do with that? And then I was jokingly referencing the rapture earlier, but that's a thing. Yeah, and then it gets intertwined. And now what do you do with this? Right.
Yeah.
But there's been something also kind of underneath the current of the Old Testament that is, I would say for many people, one of their sticking points with why they don't really do the God thing. You have atheists like Richard Dawkins, who refers to God in the Old Testament as a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser. Mm-hmm. And you read those stories, you go, what do you do with God when you've got the flood? You've got the Canaanites, you've got what feels like kind of this God condoning violence, almost this murderous tyrant, kill everybody thing. And not that we can get to all the way to the bottom of that, because I would venture to guess that most of the answers, it's more of a wrestling match of the mind as opposed to like, here is the answer.
Yeah.
Because that's tough to get to on that particular topic. But I also don't want to pretend that those topics don't exist, because that's a hang up for a lot of people.
Sure.
The hang up there is, what do you do with a God who allows the death of men, women, and children? And then again, like I said, you turn the page of the New Testament and all of a sudden that's all gone. What is happening here is God having a bipolar moment? Like what is happening, So, again, we're not going to completely answer that, but I would be interested to hear any thoughts on this kind of topic of like, again, we've got people who may come across this, who knows, in months or years, maybe wrestling with questions of faith, looking for a resource that tells, just tell me the story of God. Like what's going on in the story? And we've tried to do that in this series and in this podcast. Like, here's kind of the story. Here's what's happening. Here's some of the history. And just to put things in their proper context and historical context. But within that, there are some pretty heavy questions as well. So I'm kind of curious if you guys have thoughts on how do we handle that? The person who's just read Judges and Kings for the first time and goes, I'm not sure I want any part of this. How do we kind of help answer for them? Curious your guys' thoughts.
Where to begin?
Oh, look, we're out of time.
Well, as I say, there's not a great way to like land that plane, but we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that is a challenge for people.
No, it is. And I think just to tack on a little bit, Stan, before I will offer somewhat of initial thoughts on an answer. Won't say it's an answer, right? But it's not just a Bible problem, right? Because you're right. There is a demonstrative difference when you're reading it from the Old to the New Testament in the sense of what's on the page. But then even as folks who are approaching it in a modern sense, they go, okay, well, I read this New Testament version of God. I read this person of Jesus, and that God, then what gets kind of translated back to the world is, well, God loves everybody, right? But then it's like, but that's not how I experience from the outside in. That's not what I see in the world today. So hold on a second. Like it's a problem in the book, but it's also seemingly incongruent in life in general. And so like that
from what we see and experience, yes, it feels off.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's, I think to me, the starting point out of all of this is to not ignore it, right? So just even name it and then like wrestle with it is a really, really important first step, because it's one thing just to be like, well, I don't know, I gotta have faith and move on, turn the page. Right. Let me get to Philippians, because I really like that. And that makes me feel better. Right. Like, let me just
hurry to Philippians 2 verse 5. Hurry up.
I'll just read that because I like that one better. Right. And we do that. And there's, in some respects, that's not a terrible thing to do, but we can't ignore it. So just to let it exist and wrestle with it, I think is an important piece. I think the other element is that to recognize that there's multiple wrestling matches to be had. There's the theological one, which is, I think, what you're probably more leaning towards, which is like, what do we do with what seems to be like, is God bipolar? Is he not bipolar? Like, what do we do with these things? Yeah,
you've got your character points of God, right? Mm-hmm. That we tend to know. Like we would say, God is loving, God is just, God is gracious, God, these certain kind of character points. And then you have to try to figure out, okay, well, where do those kind of like align? Where do they come together when you read something like the Old Testament? You go, well, wait a minute, that doesn't feel loving or just or kind or gracious or whatever. So there is this kind of theological question of like, what do you do with that exactly? Yeah. So
you have that. You've got the biblical studies version of reading the story. But I think what helps to inform some of that, another element, at least that's helped me to be a little more comfortable with the ambiguity and some of the unsettling nature of reading that, is also understanding the historicity of it all. Like if you look at the ancient Near East, right, this time period in general, this is not just an Israel thing. Like this is non-biblical sources from history will say this, is that when kings declared to go to war, right, in the springtime, because that's when kings go to war, one of two things. Typically they are considered divine extensions of whatever deity they worship, right? So when they speak as though their God is telling them to go do these things. It's been affirmed that way. And after the war, they would look back and go, well, we were successful, so our God said it was a good thing, or we lost, so, well, we must not have listened or disobeyed somehow. And I think it's a short-sighted to assume that Israel doesn't have these same sort of historical just influences. And so I think there's an element that just historically doesn't take away the question, right? I think it's still there, but it's created some space for me just to kind of sit in that unsettledness, to be like, okay, like I still need to wrestle through this theologically, but I know historically there's things going on that influence just these discussions of what goes on the parchment and then it becomes on the page.
Yep. There is a lot of that. theologically, like I've got thoughts too, things that have helped me to feel a little bit more like, okay, I think I'm kind of understanding what's happening there. I'm kind of getting my hands around that, feel a little bit better about it or whatever. Again, not to take it away because it's a challenging question and you've got to deal with it. One of the things I come back to fairly often is, first of all, context matters. I'm a preacher and like, it's really important to me that you've not just plucked a verse and been upset about it, Psalm 137, like you got to read that right in the context. So part of it is a question of context. What's going on around it? What's God already said? What have his people been doing or not doing? What about the people around them? Is God influencing, which of those pieces is he specifically directing? We know he's sovereign over the process, but like, is he specifically is he like playing Risk and moving the pieces on the chessboard, on the risk board and all those types of things. So there's a huge contextual question, for me to a lot of that. And then, coming down to like, if God is loving, gracious, we know he's slow to, scripture says he's slow to anger, wants everyone to come to repentance. If those things just hold fast, then I believe in God's character, they would hold fast for all time. I don't believe that God is bipolar. I don't think he's every day can't figure out what to do with himself or whatever. Then to some degree, there has to be, in those decisions that are being made, there has to be some element of God's justice in the judgment that is coming down on them. So for instance, like it is just of God, for instance, to end something tragic like child sacrifice. If he were to allow that to go on in a people group, we would sit on this side of history and question him from the other perspective and go, well, God could have done something about that. Why didn't he? Well, he did. And then sometimes now on this side of history, we read it and we go, well, God doesn't seem very loving. And it's like, I get it. But like theologically, we would say that is actually God's justice at play, making the world a better place to some degree. And again, I don't know how much of that is just the modern mind versus how they would have thought about it, 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. But for us, that is a wrestling match to try to get our head to understand that, because we don't see that as just. And I mean, that explodes into all kinds of other modern topics of war in our day and age, the death penalty, all kinds of things. Are these things just? Are they not? Are they loving? Are they not? And so I think a lot of that ends up feeding into the question, what do you do with God on these pages, Well,
and it's interesting because as you're talking and thinking, Kevin, what you're mentioning as well is that the real richness, the real nuance in all this is, whether as God is ordaining or allowing like this violence to happen. But so much of the problem is when it comes down to when it affects, what seems to be innocent people. And just reminds me is that you take that back to what you said about, Genesis 1, where we are, all humanity is made in God's image, right? So every single person is an image bearer. And so if that alone should give us pause, concern, wrestle with anything that, as we read through, that deals with the beginnings or the endings of life, like that is a foundational piece of anything we're going to discuss, whatever side of the debate you land on. Like there's an element that you have to factor into to say that person, friend or foe, is also an image bearer. And what do we do with that? Because that should trouble you.
Yeah. Should definitely make us wrestle with what we read. I do think some people kind of come to a point in their faith, like they've wrestled with it for so long, or they've been following Jesus for so long that they kind of come to a point where they've kind of got their answers and they feel pretty secure in it. My kind of mental wrestling match on this topic is for the person who is trying to get back into faith, coming to faith for the first time, and they're reading these things and they're genuinely going, what is this? What is happening right here? And so I do think there is something to be said for not ignoring what's there and wrestling with it so that we have kind of a proper perspective and all those types of things. At the end of the day, I mean, the reality is I'm a pastor, and I kind of come to the end of this road and I look at what I know of God and what I believe about him. And one of the questions that comes across my mind is just, if this is who I believe God to be, this is who he is, this kind of character, just, loving, merciful, gracious, all these things, then is there something in the story of the Old Testament that's happening that I just don't understand yet, but am, as a created finite being, I also have to be very cautious to not try to hold an infinite, eternal, Alpha, Omega, Yahweh God under my judgment as if I know better. And so it, again, to me, that is the tug of war in all of it, is I need to ask the question, because I do need to understand. I've got to wrestle with my faith. If we love God with all of our mind, I mean, we're putting in the work. And at the same time, I do kind of come to the end of myself and I go, I don't have a good answer for that question. And sometimes at the end of the day, I have to go, well, as much as I don't like some of those stories I read, I've got to trust that there's something at work that I'm not getting, and hopefully maybe someday I will. Again, not to take away from the wrestling match, but just, yeah, it's big, and you read a lot of that. I mean, it starts in Genesis and it goes through. It feels pretty consistent. Like, you've got this, like, what do you do with this part of what comes across as God's character? What do you do with these pages, these stories? So it's a good question, but we may dig in a little bit.
How many times in the Ecclesiastes series did we say God is God and I am not?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, a lot.
That there's a lot of hevel, there's a lot of paradox and things that we don't understand. Yeah. And so the aspect of the sovereignty of God isn't something we can just overlook. It's true. It's there. It's real. Yeah. Also, I just, as you were talking, I think it's good for all of us to realize that God is okay with us to wrestle with those things. Yeah. He's a big God. He can handle our wrestling, and he wants us to wrestle. He wants us to come to him. Yeah. And to our community around us and wrestle on those things. So. Yeah.
And I wonder, again, how much of that is the goal? How much it's not the only goal, but in the discussion of these types of topics, how much of the goal is the actual exercise to wrestle and to think and to ask the questions, versus the goal being like, I need to arrive at this answer so I can be certain and say that is the only answer for it. Like, to your point, is just to say, like, how much of it is just like the invitation to wrestle, to ask the questions, to be comfortable being uncomfortable, to then walk away, learn something new, come back and ask him again, and like rinse, repeat. And I mean, that's like, that's like Psalm 1 and 2, like in of itself, right? Like that's the goal, is to just sit there and chew on this day and night and think about these things. So
meditate day and night. Yeah. And it's interesting because you'll go through seasons too, right? At one point in your faith, you're really bothered by some particular section, and kind of like what we were talking about, just in the banter of like, contextually, we all have like a favorite Bible verse. I think this was even before we started recording, but you get into that whole contextual bit of all that, and everybody's got their 1 minute, I'm really upset about this, I'm really secure here, and then 5 years later I go through something and now all of a sudden I'm really sure about that and I'm insecure about this now. And it's like that faith journey we're constantly kind of called into that wrestling match of, here's where I'm at and I got to wrestle with this again and try to understand what God's up to and try to hear his voice fresh and follow to the best of my ability. And so I think there is a lot of that we come back to regularly.
Yeah. Whew.
So losing my religion is going to be a great act 3 to the story.
Man, I if you didn't bite on this hook, I don't know. We're not going to be able to cast a better one, I don't believe.
Yeah,
so good.
I don't know.
Well, Corbett and Stan, thanks. Appreciate the conversation. And thank all of you who are listening and watching. We appreciate you joining us. Just a reminder, like and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes, and share Share the podcast with your friends and other people in your life. If you're here in the Kansas City area, we would love to have you join us here at Lee Summit Community Church on Sundays at 9:15 or 11 o'clock.
Especially at 11.
Especially at 11. We have room for you. Come on in.
Your own row.
And if you're not, are we going to cut that? Or
sorry.
Church for the introverts.
All right. And if you're not in the KC area, maybe you're giving thanks right now. I don't know. But if you're not in the KC area and you want to follow along with us, you can listen to each week's message right here where you get the podcast, or you can watch us online on our YouTube channel. So with that, we're done. All right.
Awesome. Good conversation.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
But isn't that a wild sky?